So, Doctor, we should start off by telling you that I'm feeling fine, and I could probably use a better haircut. But aside from that, all is well with me. And I know you wanted to know that before we started.
I think most people are kind of returning to the home hairdos.
Indeed, yes. All right. Well, so let's talk about this because we're starting to see an incredible disparity in cohorts of people who are A, getting infected, and B, dying from the coronavirus. In Charlotte, North Carolina, it is only 33% African American, but African Americans make up about 44% of its coronavirus cases. In Michigan, African Americans account for 33% of cases, 40% of deaths in the state, despite only being 14% of the population. Milwaukee County, Wisconsin, only 26% African American, yet African Americans account for almost 50% of the coronavirus cases and 80% of the deaths. We see more of that in places like Chicago. We see that in places like Metro New York City. What's going on here?
One of the things that we are seeing is that in people that have comorbidities or they have other medical issues that are going on at the same time, they're struggling to fight this off. So if, let's say you have a history of diabetes, or you have high blood pressure, or there's obesity, those are the people that are struggling the most with this. And it's the younger people that tend to get sick that have the obesity issues, and it's the older patients that tend to be hypertensive or diabetic that are struggling with this and are not able to fight it off. So these people are, in some respects, they're immune compromised. So they don't have a normal functioning immune system because of the other comorbidities that they have where their immune system functions the way it's supposed to, where it handles the virus. You start to kill it off, produce antibodies to it, and then you get into a healing phase or what we call a resolution phase where you can start to repair damaged tissue. What's actually happening to some of these people is that their immune system also almost becomes overactive. So they begin producing an excess of what we call cytokines, which are just chemical messengers between these immune cells that calls in more immune cells. So they get this huge reaction, and it attacks multiple organs, although the obvious thing that you're hearing about is the attack on the lungs with the bilateral pneumonias and almost the suffocation feeling that a lot of these people get. And those are the patients that end up having the highest mortality rates. And
there's another factor, of course, here that we could delineate these discrepancies, I guess, in racial cohorts versus the amount of coronavirus infections and deaths. Or we could also use another lens here too, which is income percentile. When we're looking in New York City, for instance, there are just simply far more cases amongst people whose income is in the bottom quartile of people, and it matches up almost perfectly. The lower on the income spectrum you are, the higher percentage of or higher numbers of cases exist.
Yep, absolutely. And in the Navajo Nation would be another example of that, where you have 40% of the population that doesn't even have access to running water or indoor plumbing. So how do you have hygiene, to wash off the virus and protect other people if you don't even have access to that? So it's hitting lower incomes, it's hitting minorities harder, and if you look at the sort of situations, the living situations that many of these people are in, they live in tighter or closer communities where there's not as much spread in space. Many of these people are working in jobs that are considered, essential. So if you are, let's say, a janitor at a hospital and you are living with your parents and your wife and 2 kids in a 1-bedroom apartment somewhere in New York, you're going to take a bus or a transit system or something back and forth to the hospital, and it does two things. One, it puts your whole family at risk, but it also puts other people at risk in transportation. But because you're so tightly packed together in that community, and chances are that these people are not eating super healthy. They're probably not doing the things that we would push people to do lifestyle wise to try to stay healthy. Their risk goes way up, and educational levels play a role. Income plays a role. All of these things are what we're starting to see play out in this virus, and who is becoming the most affected, and what communities are the hardest hit.
Right. I mean, if you're living in some type of food desert, essentially, where you're getting your food from basically a mini mart or a bodega or something like that, your access to things like fresh vegetables and fruit is limited. Your access to all sorts of and I mean it runs the gamut, right? I mean, but it seems to me, I mean, the central driving force here is wealth inequality. I don't have to take public transport if I'm wealthy. I don't have to go to my job as a checkout person at the supermarket or at the hardware store, or I don't have to work for Instacart or wherever it is. If I'm wealthy, I am I'm living in I'm not living in cramped quarters. I'm maybe not. My parents can afford maybe to live on their own, and they're not necessarily living in the same place as me. I mean, all of these factors seems to me to be boiled down to income disparity, and in some respects, and I feel like this is happening both in a health, under like a plane of looking at this in terms of health, but also in terms of looking at this in terms of the sort of the health of our societal fabric. That coronavirus is basically the gas in the mine, and those folks who are marginalized are the canaries.
Yeah, it's a good analogy. We had no idea, I think, what to expect from this, or where it was going to hit, or what's going to happen. But as this information comes out, I think it's helpful to us to know this, right? So we know now where it's starting to hit, and we know what communities are starting to hit. And I think that allows us at least the opportunity to know where the resources need to go. Because if you just look and say, we've got 50 states and 50 governors, and everybody gets equal, everybody gets the same thing treatment-wise, everybody gets the same number of whatever, ventilators, PPE, whatever, that is probably not going to help us in solving this issue. I mean, right now, if we know this information, if we know where these communities are the hardest hit, it's going to help us to get into those communities. I think at least that should be the target, right? That we start looking at that and saying, okay, where we have the maybe the biggest issues with whatever income inequality as an example, or we have minority communities, and maybe even language barriers are an issue. Those are probably the communities we ought to look at and start to get resources into to try to help these people, and that helps everybody else. So, like you're saying, the canary in the coal mine. If we just kind of let them sink on their own, that means that the spread is probably going to continue. I think if you can, in effect, target those communities where it's the hardest hit, and get the most resources into those communities and try to contain it and treat those people, you probably are saving everybody else from the same catastrophe.
And along those lines, there was a piece in the New York Times talking about how, at least in New York, there has been a surprising to local doctors, absence of, and not a total absence, but an absence of an inordinate amount or a disparate amount of people with asthma, which you would anticipate, right? Would be,
yeah.
I mean, and what do you make of that? I mean, and again, obviously, you're doing this from a distance, and it's hard to say. But does it feel like, I mean, that we know more or less of this virus than you would have anticipated we would know by now?
I think that's the hard part. That it's fairly fresh for us. I mean, we're kind of looking at it maybe over the last 6 weeks once it basically started hitting us. And Italy was trying to figure it out. France was trying to figure it out. I think China was kind of a mix. There was some information coming out and some was being squelched. So we're behind the curve on how are we supposed to respond and who's supposed to get it. I mean, you would think if it's a lung issue that asthma would be a big component of the people that are affected by it. But yeah, we're not really necessarily seeing that. And I think that maybe has to do with, again, where the receptor site is for where the virus attaches, that it's tied in a little bit more with cardiovascular disease than it is with an issue like asthma. I think if you look from and just to kind of give you a little background, my mindset on this stuff, I'm not an infectious disease guy, so I'm not the guy on the front lines that is trying to figure out everybody coming into the emergency room. So, but I'm a performance guy, work in the sports medicine world, and our mindset is a little bit different in how we see or view problems when we're dealing with performance. So instead of just saying, symptom X equals treatment Y, we're looking at some basic principles. One is you have genetics that are involved, and that's the loaded gun. You can't do anything about your genetics, but it's everything around it that's going to pull the trigger. So this ties in with some of the community things that we were talking about, where in an environment where maybe there's heavy pollution seems to be involved, but we're not really necessarily correlating that with asthma. People whose diets probably are not, as you mentioned, access to fresh vegetables and good clean foods is probably not as good for some of the lower privileged people in this country. So what do they have as resources for their immune system to fight this off? They're going to struggle with this. So you have lifestyle factors like exercise and sunlight exposure and, vitamin D that seems to help balance the immune system, nutrients that may be helpful out of the diet, zinc and vitamin C, which are not necessarily things that we reach for as first line agents to say, hey, I'm going to treat this person in the emergency room with zinc. But when we're talking on the preventative side, if we're looking at risk factors, do any of these things play a role? I mean, does your nutritional deficit play a role in your chances of becoming sick? And I think all of that does. If I want an NBA player to be at their peak, I'm going to look at all these factors, right? I'm going to test for their nutrition. I want to make sure they're getting enough protein in the diet that they can,
But
repair.
yet, and now. They were obviously more exposed, but they did not seem to be a cohort of people, specifically the NBA, that seemed, they seemed susceptible, right? I mean,
Right.
Presumably, when you're talking about the NBA, you're talking about several hundred guys who are about in as good a shape as you can get, I would imagine.
Yeah. Yep, very very good shape. Although I think it's a misconception that they are in perfect shape because they train so much and there's travel and they miss sleep, and so they're almost on the overtrained side in some circumstances. That probably leads them in some circumstances to become a little bit immune compromised. So
Interesting.
yeah. And that's what we have to fight on our end is how do we handle that? But in this circumstance, I mean, there were some guys, right? A couple players with Utah. Their center Rudy Gobert kind of, unfortunately, I think, had the misconception that they couldn't get it. And that was, he kind of made a joke about it, which he apologized for. I'm sure he felt horrible for. But there were some players that became infected. And then everybody in the league kind of clamped down and said, okay, we're going to have massive spread if we don't do something. And that was sort of the beginning of, at least on the sports world side, saying, okay, we can't just let this ride and keep going. But
I think that pushed. I mean, frankly, if the NBA doesn't shut down when it does, I'm afraid that we are probably looking at nationwide, and certainly in New York, thousands of more deaths.
I agree.
I think. I mean, because there was a real reluctance to shut this down, and the NBA shutting down, I think, was the moment where I think people's sense that this is serious crystallized.
Yes.
And so I think in many respects, I think we'll look back to that moment when the NBA in particular shut down as sort of maybe potentially saving thousands of lives, because in New York, we missed the threshold by literally, a tiny, tiny bit in terms of busting through the number of ICU beds that existed there. And I think if they had shut down New York City a couple of days later, if people in New York, hadn't seen what happened with the NBA, that's when people started to sort of say, like, hey, wait a second, this could be real. And it had a big import. Well, Dr. Dave LeMay, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, and great to talk to you again, Sam.
You too.